this is a fight for liberation. This is not a civil war. This is not a conflict within brothers and sisters. This is a fight for liberation. And Ethiopian people are resisting. The Horn of Africa is resisting. So that's how I see it, Hermela. And I think that, you know, us coming together and even this panel right here is a sign that as people, as people of African descent all around the world, we've had enough and we're saying no more.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to hit on a couple of points, there's about 120 million people in Ethiopia. The story that has been told is about this Tigrayan ethnicity, of which I am one of them. That's maybe 6 or 7 million people, but not even their story. It's about this political group that claims to be the liberators of this ethnicity. It was formed about 50 years ago for that cause, but has long abandoned that goal. It's abandoned the Tigrayan people, the Tigrayan region. It's poor, it's undeveloped. But when it was essentially kicked out of power on the people's struggle, it went back to that region and started to feed into them this idea that, oh, the rest of the country hates your ethnicity. It's really about they're trying to wipe you out, so that they can mobilize them to fight the war to retake power. And because that region was poor, because there wasn't you know, a lot for a lot of people to live for, then it's easier to mobilize them for war, because all of a sudden they go from just poor and nothing to heroes, war heroes, right? So I would say 100 million people, or people that represent the viewpoint of 100 million people, were not being heard for nearly a year. CNN would literally ignore all of these voices. New York Times just continued to hit on the same points. And it wasn't until No More, hashtag No More campaign, as well as the military defeat on the Ethiopian end, that finally that you got CNN doing one report yesterday on some of the atrocities in a neighboring region from the Tigray. And that was because they were sort of, their hand was forced. The armed insurgents were losing, and so they finally had to listen. So let's go over to Simon, who's Eritrean. And Simon, if you could just sort of start at the beginning of your journey, where you started to realize that the Eritrea story was being skewed, and talk about some of the key words that are used when it comes to Eritrea that people should look out for.
Sure. So as Nebiyu was talking, you know, I was kind of thinking back about my own experience, understanding, reading about Eritrea, and I just remember, like, it was, you're seeing so many similarities. So I was just coming, I had just finished high school, going into college, and I was doing a lot of reading, and I had read at the time, because this was the early 2000s, that Eritrea was ran by a dictator, that it was an authoritarian state. And then you would see headlines like, Eritrea, the place where dreams never come true. Like things like this, like totally hyperbolic. And then I thought, like, okay, what is a dictator exactly? You know, and so I looked into it, and I realized that, like, this term dictator was truly a subjective term that's used by the media, usually to vilify a government. Also the term regime, authoritarian, you go down the list, they have these like very, you know, useful buzzwords that they use to vilify and isolate a country. And in fact, as I started to do more reading over time, actually this was later discovered through WikiLeaks, that there was an isolation strategy against Eritrea to wait for the country to implode. So they, it was Vicky Huddleston back in 2005 in a diplomatic cable that was leaked. She says the strategy was to isolate Eritrea and wait for it to implode economically. So this was the strategy, and they thought by putting Eritrea in this long-term situation where it's sanctioned, where it's you know, vilified in the media, hostile psychological warfare against the people of Eritrea, even drawing youth out of the country using specialized asylum procedures that are unprecedented in the world. I mean, literally, there's no country that has been targeted for migration on planet Earth more than Eritrea. through their asylum procedures and these things known as eligibility guidelines by UNHCR. So as I started to read and read and read, you just see all these strategies that they use to destroy the country. And the reason why was because while TPLF in Ethiopia was basically serving as what they should be calling the dictator. I should be saying, let's just get rid of the word dictator. But they were ruling by an iron fist, and even Genocide Watch was tracking all the things that they were doing. You had a force in the region that was standing up to TPLF, which is the puppet of the United States. And so they had to vilify Eritrea. They had to target it in order to prop up TPLF and to keep it in power, and to also maintain their rule in the region through imperialism. And so what they realized is that Eritrea had to go, or excuse me, the Eritrean government had to go, and the people that were backing the Eritrean government, but they couldn't say that. They couldn't say that they're targeting the state. It's always just in one person. It's in the president, for instance. And this is a very Goebbels type strategy with I think he called it the concentration of fire, where you concentrate all the fire on one person in order to attack the entire nation. You put it on one person. And so basically that's what they did. And so, President Isaias was vilified and made to look like a crazy lunatic. Interviews with Al Jazeera would start off with questions like, so why are you a dictator? I mean, it's the most absurd thing. It's like almost satirical. And so how does someone respond to something like this? And so what we realized over time as a population, for especially the young like myself, is that they really they use this type of language, the dictator, the authoritarian. They make it seem like you shouldn't be proud to be an Eritrean. You're almost like ashamed to be an Eritrean because of the fact that your country seems like a place that's horrible with terrible leadership. Even culturally, the very existence of Eritrea seems like a bad thing. I remember they used to call it a slither of a nation. This was Jeffrey Gentleman in the New York Times. Even though Eritrea is larger than England and Israel and other nations that we don't call tiny. They call Eritrea tiny. It's a tiny country. They don't say that for other nations. And so when they hate you, when they target you, they give you all the negative press. It's always negative, negative, negative. And so anyone who looks at it carefully, any Eritrean or any observer of Eritrea, will soon learn that it is it's part of their propaganda, and everything that we're hearing today from these other countries, they were doing it to Eritrea for almost 20 years now, since 1998 actually.
Really interesting. Yeah, I mean, even I as an Ethiopian bought into some of that. There was just always, Eritrea was always in the news as, like Simon said, dictatorship, human rights abuses, etc. There's a recent, it leaked recently anyway, or it came out recently, video where this journalist is interviewing the president of Azerbaijan, and she's talking to him about issues of press freedom, etc. And he just kept snapping back at her like, do you guys have press freedom? Is what happened to Julian Assange an example of what press freedom is? And then even more sort of covertly, when you really look at what the mainstream media is doing, why is it that none of those reporters from New York Times, Reuters, CNN, why is it that they cannot tell a different narrative, right? So it's more covert. Me as someone that has reported for corporate media, no one just says it to your face that you can't say this or you can't say that. It's usually in the edit. When someone's editing your script, they'll take something out, they'll word it a certain way, and the next thing you know, the whole narrative is diluted. So there really isn't press freedom in this country. I mean, there is in the sense that if you're independent media, you're not going to get arrested, generally speaking. But in terms of what's out there as being touted as true press, it's really government propaganda. Hey, everybody, please support independent journalism by going to patreon.com/HermelaTV and becoming a member. Thank you so much for your support.